This game is too hard. I was expecting a more casual game experience.
You are such a baby!
And you know, what I want to know is why I'm finding out just now about all of these homebrew rules. This is bullcrap! And you know, the characters that we made, they don't really work that well together either.
That's because you're an idiot! If you hadn't dumped intelligence, our group wouldn't be quite so dysfunctional!
Yeah, well, all you want to do is kill things. You're like deranged in the head.
Yeah, well at least I don't get my face painted like a 2-year-old at a circus!
If only we had had a session 0.
Welcome to the DM Lair. I'm Luke Hart, and I've been a Dungeon Master since high school. On this channel, I give practical Dungeon Master advice that you can implement at your game table. Today in the Lair, we'll be talking about how to run a Session 0. Now, a quick disclaimer, I'm going to be talking about how I personally do it, and I'm sure there are lots of other legitimate ways to go about it. Anyway, a Session 0 is a game session with all of the players and Dungeon Master present that occurs before you actually start playing your campaign. It's used to set expectations for the game and get everyone on the same page. This is going to help ensure your D&D campaign is primed for success. That said, I strongly recommend that you don't skip the Session 0. And if you've already begun playing and you didn't have a Session 0, that's okay. No judgment here. You can still take a little time at your next game session to cover some of the important things I'm about to go over. First, the pre-Session 0 and the pitch. Wait, what? This is getting confusing. Right, so before even having a Session 0, I suggest a little homework, you can call it. See, the Session 0 is technically kicking the campaign off with your group, but before you're ready to do that, you need a little information from your players. First, you need to understand what kind of D&D games they enjoy playing. Gritty realism, beer and pretzels, horror, high fantasy, low magic, high magic, Monty Hall, and so on and so forth. And then ask them if there's anything they are particularly interested in doing in the game. For instance, your players might decide they all want to play mercenaries, working for a guild, or dragon hunters, or people stranded on a strange island. You can get this information best through conversations, though email can work for this as well. And then you take this information and develop a campaign idea from it. By taking into consideration your players' desires, you're more likely to create and run a campaign that they will enjoy. The caveat to this, of course, is that it must also be a campaign that you, the Dungeon Master, will enjoy running. I mean, you're a part of this group too, and your wants and needs are just as important as your players. If you hate gritty realism and horror, don't, for the love of all that is holy, agree to run that game. I mean, you could, but you won't be having any fun. You'll be working your butt off prepping a game that you won't be enjoying. And don't you think that your lack of enjoyment will come across in the game, making it rather suck in comparison to running a game that you actually like? It will. And the game will suffer as a result. Something you could do too is develop 2 or 3 campaign pitches for your group, and then see which one your players want to play. Again, each of these should be something that you actually would enjoy doing. And then once you've decided what campaign you'll actually be running, you need to go prep your happy little butt off. This is part of being a Dungeon Master that gets little recognition or appreciation, but it's the most critical. Prep the main ideas of the campaign and create the first adventure. Then, and only then, are you ready for your Session 0. Now, at your Session 0, the first thing I suggest going over with your players is describing your game style and the flavor of the campaign. This is where you confirm things like gritty realism or beer and pretzels. You let people know things like, hey, if you're a murder hobo in my games, expect me to run my game world like a real world where there will be consequences for running around and killing everybody. Or you let them know something like, hey guys, I roll my dice out in the open and I play them as they lie. And if you die, you die. Don't expect me to jump in and save your PCs. That's up to you. Or you could tell them that this is a casual and relaxed game. I'll be playing the rules kind of loosely, so please don't get all wound up if we don't do everything by the book. The second thing I recommend explaining to them is the important information about the setting the game takes place in. For instance, all of my games take place in the Forgotten Realms because that's the setting I started using back in high school and I just kind of stuck with it. So I will tell players important things they should know about the immediate area the game starts in. The immediate area. Don't go on a 2-hour lecture about everything in the setting. You will bore your players to death, and they won't remember hardly any of it anyway. So don't bother. Which leads me to an important point. Handouts. Don't just tell your players about the setting. Give them crap that helps them remember. Otherwise, guess what? They'll forget because player brains are practically made to forget important details about the game world. Wait, did I just insult most of my viewers? I should definitely cut this out in post. But I probably won't. So, examples from my recent Dragon Heist Session 0. They started out in the Yawning Portal Inn as their hub of operations. So, I gave them a handout with photos of notable NPCs from the inn. And I had each player pick one of them as a friendly acquaintance. And then I gave my players copies of the Code Legal of Waterdeep. You know, so when they started to break laws and get arrested, they wouldn't be able to give me the excuse of, "You never told me." Actually, none of my players are like that, but whatever. Then I gave them a map of Waterdeep and gave them a brief explanation of the different wards in the city. Finally, I gave them a quick overview of important information about Waterdeep. You know, who's in charge, what the government is like, major landmarks and buildings that might interest them, that sort of thing. And before you think that I'm a little too much of a genius, the module actually already had handouts for many of those things, so I just made copies of them and then passed them out. But if there had not been handouts, I would have totally made my own up for sure. By the way, this video is sponsored by my patrons over on Patreon. In particular, I want to give a huge thank you to the following patrons: Aaron Glom, Mr. Lemon Pie, Seth M, Theta Tag, and William. Also, just so you know, one of my Patreon tiers enables you to play D&D twice a month with me as your Dungeon Master. And as of the recording of this video, there are only 2 spots left. So if you're interested in supporting the channel and maybe even playing some D&D with me, you can check out my Patreon page at the link down in the description. The next thing I suggest doing at your Session 0 is explaining any homebrew rules you may have for the game. This is an important point because your homebrew rules may influence the types of characters that your players create. For instance, if you've nerfed elves into oblivion, your players deserve to know that before they create an elven character. I personally don't have too many homebrew rules because mostly I like players to be able to depend on the player handbook as a source of truth for how the rules work. The few homebrew rules I do have were made to correct imbalances or problems in the game, and most of them were decided based on player input. Now, for my Dragon Heist game, I was introducing 2 new systems to the game: luck points and lingering injuries, so I made sure to explain them to my players. Next, now that you have given your players most of the important information needed to inform character creation, it's time for your players to create their characters at the game table. Like, literally give them blank character sheets, have them roll stats, and create their characters. I think there are lots of advantages to having players create their characters together, one of which is the simple question of classes. Most groups I've played with like to make sure they have main roles covered and everyone doesn't show up with like a rogue or something. This also gives them the chance to talk about things like if their characters know each other already. For instance, in my Dragon Heist game right now, 2 of the characters, a Warforged monk and a goblin archer, have known each other for years, and the goblin rides around on a platform that the monk wears on its back. Cool things like this can't happen if everyone goes off on their own to create PCs. Players need to talk to each other to come up with ideas like that. Now, I will say this though. Good luck getting your players to actually wait to create their characters. At my most recent Session 0, all of the players except 1 showed up with their characters already created. And guess what? I made their happy little butts sit there patiently while the one player that actually did what I asked created his character. but it was okay because the other players had lots of loose ends to figure out anyway. The next thing I do is have my players create their backstories right there at the table. Because if there's one thing I've discovered is that if you ask your players to create backstories, only about half of them actually do, if you're lucky. And those backstories that you do get might not even be what you consider a backstory. Or they'll be like 20 pages long and takes you forever to read them. So, we create backstories at session 0, and I give them a template for it. It's really just a front and back piece of paper with several questions designed to draw out important information about their characters. There's a link to that template down in the description for you to use too if you want. Now, I do plan to do a future video about creating backstories, and I'll probably walk through why I have those specific questions on my template. However, for now, let's just say that those specific questions will help you as a dungeon master get information about the characters that you can later use in your campaign. This is, of course, assuming that you as a dungeon master even care about backstories and will even bother to use them in your campaign. Personally, I think games benefit greatly when dungeon masters incorporate elements from backstories into their games, and backstories help players roleplay their characters better, but hey, it's your game. So if backstories aren't your thing and your players view them as tedious bits of torture, you don't actually need them. I have run games before where almost no one had a backstory, and we still all had tons of fun. At this point, your players have their characters and backstories created, so it's time to start your first adventure. I usually try to play for at least an hour or so at the end of my session 0. That way, we all leave the session feeling like we actually played D&D a little bit. Let me know down in the comments if there are other things you like to do at your session 0s, and click right here to learn how I create campaigns for my groups. And next week, I'll be telling you a story about a time I threw 2 Remorazes and 2 Ogre Magi against a level 12 group. And until next time, let's play D&D.